all the way from Vienna, Dr. Philip Lawrence Furman from University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences, or BOKU. Good afternoon from Indonesia once again, Dr. Philip.
Good afternoon also from my side.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's still morning time in Vienna. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, good morning then. Thank you very much for joining us today. On this lovely afternoon, Dr. Philip will share his knowledge and experiences with us regarding food composites, linking food structure and sensory perception. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Iskandar Siregar, the Director of International Program of IPB University. Good afternoon, Prof. Iskandar.
Yeah, good afternoon, Indonesian time, and still, I think, good morning, to Vienna. Thank you, Dr. Philip, to attend, to participate, and be ready to deliver your lecture in this very nice moment. Yeah, thank you, Mbak Nada.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Iskandar, for welcoming us today. I also would like to welcome Dr. Dasa Hunayfi, Assistant Director for International Collaborations of IPB University, and also our own sensory expert. Good afternoon, Pak Dasa.
Good afternoon. Good morning there.
Good morning in Vienna.
In Vienna.
So to start our agenda today, I would like to invite Pak Dasa to maybe say hi a little bit, introduce our esteemed speakers, and guide us through today's discussion with Dr. Philip. So Pak Dasa, the platform is yours.
Okay. So thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to thank to our invited speaker, Dr. Philip. He is actually our friend, our IPBTalk. He has already visited in 2018 with one of our alumni, Dr. Belinda. And now he, after postdoctoral in Canada, he is now working in BOKU University, the University of Life Science, with the motto University des Leben, Universität des Leben. So it means the University of Life, which is focusing more on agriculture and food science and technology, like our university in IPB. So thank you very much, Dr. Philip Furman. So in Indonesia, instead of we are mostly call the speaker based on the first name, but perhaps in Europe it's the last name. So sometimes we have difficulty to pronounce last name. So that's why I always follow Indonesian to directly mentions the first name. Apologize for that. So this is actually sharing in IPBTalk and also sensory talk. So the collaborations between always supporting from our international director, international program director, Professor Iskandar, because I'm working two sides for the Department of Food Science and also for the international program, which is I'm working for. So now is the time for combining those two, also in relations to food structurings, which is food composites, linking to sensory perception. So how, because sometimes sensory perception is all our perception, linking to our sensory structure as well. I mean the food structure as well. Some of there is also a new professor here, Professor Dede Robiato Aldawia, working also in sensory and mostly working with the sensory structures like Dr. Philip. Some might also mention that food structure is sometimes difficult because it's more complex. So we will now learning about that through the IPBTalk, and there are thank you to the students during the midterm exams. We can have the IPBTalk and for 79 because of I know that this is very difficult during the midterm exam. You have to also to join this IPBTalk, but as mentioned, this is not so you have to enjoy when learning about the food because sometimes next week it has already Ramadan time in Indonesia. So when we talk about food, perhaps it would be difficult, yeah, because of we thinking about the food, we imagine the food, so sometimes make our fasting not really good. So that's why we come up with the idea, perhaps it would be earlier before the Ramadan to have this IPBTalk for food composites, linking food structure and sensory perception. Without further ado, so please give a welcome applause to Dr. Philip for sharing us with the presentation, Food Composite, Linking Food Structure and Sensory Evaluation. To Dr. Philip, the Zoom floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm really happy to share a bit about a topic that I find really interesting, and I hope I can also show you why I find it so interesting. I'll try to share my screen and see if it works. Do you see? Does it work? Perfect.
Yes, nice and clear.
Perfect. That's great. So yeah, I'm. If there are any questions, I don't know in this format what you prefer. I'm very happy if there are questions. I just hear there are some in the background. There's some construction works. I hope you still hear me. If there are questions, please let me know. If you have a preference in the chat or in between or in the end, I'm fine with it. Yeah, so I will talk about food composites and some ideas on linking food structure and sensory perception. Yeah, my name is Philipp Fuhrmann. I'm working at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, also BOKU, and I'm located in the group of food physics. So just a very brief background on looking at food safety. Then I went for a PhD to Wageningen University, Netherlands, where I worked on physics and physical chemistry. This is where I got into contact with Indonesian foods. In Austria, it's actually very difficult to find Indonesian foods, and in Vienna, there's not a single Indonesian restaurant. So really, I hope in the future that will change, because I really miss Indonesian food actually a lot. So then I did a postdoc in Canada at Ryerson University, and then I had the chance to go back to Vienna, where I'm working as university assistant / postdoc. Yeah, in food physics. So that's the building. That's how it looks like. I mean, there are different campuses around the city. The one in the background, that's the nice old, the main building. I'm located in the newer building, just somewhere in the back of this building here. So food physics. What do people that work with food physics? What are we interested in? Well, foods. So this is our research materials, so really materials that we know from every day, like ice cream, for example. And it's basically taking a material science viewpoint on foods and trying to understand them. So typical materials are materials like emulsions, like some dairy drinks, for example, gels, foams, crystalline materials, and they all consist of ingredients that are basically food ingredients, so proteins, fats, carbohydrates. And questions, research questions in this area, they are about what is the structure? Can we design the structure of a food? How does it link to the functionality of the product? Linking then to processing, to production, chemical interactions, physical chemical interactions, and of course the sensory perception, because in the end we want to eat the product. So this is also a very important aspect. So just as an example, what are things we look at is like the flow behavior of foods, like how do they flow, how thick are they, how do they fracture, and this links also again to processing, consumption, storage stability. Another aspect looks at friction. This is then more interested in what happens in the mouth. I will come to these things a bit in more detail later. So that you see also a couple of faces from the department. This is the head of the institute, Professor Domik. He's microbiologist. So the department is really multidisciplinary. So we have different groups in physics, in chemistry, food microbiology, food hygiene. And with physics specifically, we have 2 people working at the moment. And this is my colleague, Denise Bender, and me. And yeah, in terms of what do we do is we try to cover a really broad range of length scales through mainly experiments. So here we are working mainly experimentally with all sorts of techniques to better understand the structure of foods. So the title kind of promised something about composite food and food composites. And I think one question is actually, what are composite foods, or what are food composites? And this is something that really, I think, depends on your perspective, what you're interested in. So from my perspective, composite foods are individual food items that are built from different materials. So for example, think of a dispersion where you have particles in a fluid, or think of an emulsion, like milk, for example, where you have fat in water, so liquid in a liquid, or emulsion or particle-filled gels, where you have gel with particles or with droplets in there. You can think of cheese, for example. So you have some sort of outer phase, and you have something dispersed in this material. So that's, from my understanding, for example, a composite food. And you can look at, well, what are the interactions between the different phases, and how do they determine the product properties? Yeah, just some examples: yogurt, mayonnaise, cheese. You see a lot of dairy products. And the texture of these products, this is really determined then by the structure. And the structure is determined from these different phases. So an example that I found, and I'm very sorry about the pronunciation, the bakso, where you have a protein gel structure, where you have dispersed fat, kind of, and that defines, and that really drives the structure and the properties of this product and of this material. So if people are not familiar with the term texture, texture in general describes qualities of a food that we can feel. So through touching it, through eating it, so with the tongue, with the teeth, with the palate. And the foods can have different textures. They can be crispy, they can be crunchy, they can be hard, they can be tender, chewy. Yeah, like all sorts of qualities that we can perceive. Now, this is one viewpoint on food composites or composite foods, because other people may completely disagree. So I find this nice drawing from a colleague of mine, and where you see what I just told now is really very much on this left side. So this is food structure. It's very small length scales. You have particles, you have droplets dispersed in a matrix. But you can also take a different viewpoint, different angle. So if you're interested in other fields like nutrition, like behavior, you maybe think of composite foods on a much larger length scale. So to give you an example here, for me, this burger, this patty would be a composite food, because you have protein and fat as different phases. But from another viewpoint, composite, this burger would be a composite food, because you have large scale, centimeter scale ingredients. You have a burger, you have vegetables, you have bread, and they interact, and they basically modify how we eat the food and how we perceive the food. So I'll give you a couple of examples to both length scales. I will start with small length scales, because that's where I'm mainly working with. So emulsions, dispersions, particle-filled gels. So these are the materials where we always have some sort of dispersed phase in a continuous phase. And yeah, I will try to give you some examples how the structure in these composites affects the texture and the sensory, and how we could try to link these different aspects. So one example are emulsion and emulsion-filled gels, where the fat and the oil really has a large influence on how we perceive the foods. As an example for emulsions, you have this dairy drink here, or some cheese, for example. And many foods that contain fat, we like them a lot. So basically, we like fatty foods. This is why also there is quite some relevance to understanding what the fat does to a food item. And from a physical point of view, a material science point of view, they are emulsions or emulsion-filled gels. And the properties of these materials are defined very much by the dispersed oil. So, for example, the amount, how big are the droplets, and how do the droplets, how does the oil interact with the food where it's dispersed in. So this, you can see this from a very practical viewpoint. You can see this as a toolbox, this knowledge. You can modify the texture and the perception, so the texture of a food and the way we perceive them. So, for example, you can add more oil to your emulsion. If you make a dairy drink, it will get thicker, the viscosity will increase, and of course people will perceive that. But we cannot unlimited add oil to a product, because then we'll get problems also with caloric intake. The size of droplets is something we can modify, so we can make them smaller, bigger, and this will also change the way we perceive it. This will change the sensory perception. And also very much if you have a more solid-like food, if you have droplets and the food, if they interact, you will get very hard materials. But if they repel each other, you will get weaker materials. So this is also something that you can control this via the emulsifier used to make this food, and you can tune the perceived hardness. So these are a couple of things that are known, and you can find them in literature. And I would like to show you one example where we had a look at what other ways do we have to tune the structure to get a specific sensory perception. So normally the fat is distributed in a nicely homogeneous way through the product. This is something you aim for, because then it's a quite stable product. So the blue bar here is the continuous, it can be water or a gel, and the yellow dots are oil droplets. Now what you could also try to get are emulsions where you have the droplets clustered. So where you have some areas with a lot of fat and some areas with less fat. And if you have such clusters, these clusters may differ in their size, they may differ in their stability, and they may differ in their interactions. And so these are some parameters you could imagine that you may be able to control. And we were wondering, well, if we have these materials, if you have this inhomogeneity, this heterogeneous distribution, what would it do to a product? Can we use this as a structuring tool? And why did we think so? Because it was based on an early observation of some researchers. They observed if they have a gel, so just imagine like an agar gel, and you add some fat. The more fat you add, the stiffer, the harder this gel gets. And if you have a homogeneous, nicely distributed oil phase, this is a pretty nice, pretty clear link. Now, what they observed is if the fat is not nicely distributed, but you have some areas with more fat, some areas with less fat, is the more fat you add, again, the stiffness increases, so the gel gets harder, but it gets more hard compared to the homogeneous distribution. So based on this observation, we thought, well, this could be actually interesting if we can control this. So we thought of ways, okay, how can we control this? How can we control the size, the stability, and the interactions of such fat droplet clusters? And what would it do to the food properties? What would it do to the elasticity, to the flow behavior, and to the lubrication behavior, which very much links to what happens in the mouth? And of course, we also thought, let's have a look at the sensory perception if people consume these foods, right? Would people feel the difference? With the motivation was then to understand, okay, how does microstructure link to perception? And this possible application viewpoint would be, well, if we can modify a product, can we use this to reduce ingredients, to make it less energy dense? Can we obtain desired microstructures, for example, through new routes? Or can we most ideally also improve liking? And a very, very short version of this is basically we looked at, if we have a material with oil droplets like here on the left side, is it different from a product where we have the droplets, and the droplets are these black areas on the right side? So is there a difference between those two? And to keep it very short, yes, there is a difference. And by clustering oil droplets, what you can do is you can really increase the viscosity of a product, of an emulsion. Think a dairy drink, a nutritious beverage. You can increase it a lot. And this also increases what is called the effective volume fraction. So that means that if you have a product that contains oil, it has, if you make this inhomogeneous distribution, your emulsion will act as if there's much more oil in there, even though there is not so much oil in there. So you could think about using it as a reduction strategy. And this is also something people perceive. So if you increase the thickness and if you increase the effective volume fraction, we did a sensory test, and people really said, well, this is much more creamy, much thicker, and it's more coatings. These are all attributes that you want in your beverage, for example, because people like creamy products. So what are ways to use this? Well, you could reduce thickening agents, for example. You could reduce the fat content, and you basically improve the in-mouth viscosity. Now, we thought this looks very nice in beverages. Does it work also in other foods? So we thought, well, let's look at ice cream. And in ice cream, what is called shape retention is really important. It's a really important parameter that you look at. So you look at over the time. So you have here on basically going from top to bottom here. You see over time how the ice cream melts. And here we have different amounts of fat in the ice cream. So 5%, 10, 15, 25%. And we see like, okay, if you have normal standard ice cream, how does it change if the fat is nicely distributed in the product? We thought, okay, this is how it looks like with normal standard ice cream. What would happen if we now make these clustered emulsions in there? If you have ice cream where the fat is not evenly distributed. Now what we saw is that it's not good for the ice cream. So you want actually a high shape retention. And we saw if you cluster the emulsions, the ice cream structure really gets worse. So what we learned from that is that the clustering is not always something you want. So in liquid beverages, this might be something to think about. But for example, in ice cream, it tells us, well, in ice cream, an homogeneously distributed fat is important for the structure. And this is very much linked to basically you want a fat network in your ice cream. And with these clusters, you don't get a nice network. So the clustering doesn't work, but we've learned, okay, in ice cream, you want the homogeneous distribution. So you can, for this example, you can have your fat distributed in different ways. And so actually a very small length scale. I mean, we talk here about sub-millimeter, like micrometer scale. Changes in structure, you can affect very much the textures. You can change the texture of beverages, of ice creams, and you change the sensory perception. Another example is on an even smaller length scale. So this is this time really on a molecular length scale. If you think of, again, drinks, beverages, and the role of emulsifiers. So this research is very much linked to a trend, which is dairy alternative, plant-based milk replacers, which are emulsions. So oil, you have mixtures of oil and water, and you use emulsifiers. So these are your oil droplets, for example, and you use emulsifiers, which basically go on top of the oil phase. And why do we need them? Well, we need them to stabilize the emulsion, because you can imagine if you have water and oil and you try to mix them, it will separate, of course. So you need something that stabilizes this emulsion to have it in the store, so that when your consumers buy it, well, it also still looks nice and yeah, like something you want to buy. But we can also use that, and this is not so often used, I would say, to tune the mechanical properties and the sensory perception. And I'll hope to show you some examples for that. Again, how we can use structure, and this time on a really small length scale, to modify texture and sensory perception. So the example here was based on a project with non-dairy cream replacer. The aim was of this project was to make a whippable non-dairy cream. So basically, you normal cream, you whip and you get a nice cream. And we can also, if we can make that from any other sorts of fats. So again, you have oil or fat in water. We tried different fats, like we tried coconut oil, HPKO, about 35%. We thought, okay, we need to stabilize it, of course. So we need an emulsifier. Which one should we use? Well, and this table is on purpose so small because I don't want to make any advertisement. We went to a supplier for emulsifiers, and you get these huge tables with like very large number of emulsifiers. So the question was like, what should we do? Let's give it a try. And typically, let's give it a try leads to very interesting and very complex problems. So we focused on two families of emulsifiers. One is called citram. And now, if you're familiar with emulsifiers, you will know that. If not, I'll give you a very short idea. You have basically molecules that have a hydrophilic part, so a part that likes the water, and a hydrophobic part that prefers to be in the oil. And so it goes, because it has these two parts, it basically goes in between water and oil and helps them to not mix again. Like if you, for example, have water and oil, you add this emulsifier so that it stays nicely combined. And here the citram, why is it called citram? Because it's derived also from citric acid. You find in lemons. And this is the head group here. And then you add like this tail, and this tail can vary. This is a fatty acid, and this can vary. And the sucrose ester is a second family where you have one part, again, hydrophilic and hydrophobic part. The hydrophilic part is sugar, like normal sugar you find in your household, and again, some fatty acid. And there are many different versions of the emulsifiers, and we tried a couple of them. So we tried stearic acid citram. Stearic acid citram, basically, the difference is just here in this molecule. It's a very small difference, where you don't have a double bond, but you have just a saturated fatty acid. And oleic acid, where you do have this double bond. So it's a really small difference, but it makes a huge difference. So one product, for example, is solid at room temperature, and the other product is liquid at room temperature. And for the sucrose esters, you get a lot of different they are all commercially available. You can have one fatty acid attached, or two, or five, or many, and so you get a range of products. And again, you could have theoretically also different types of fatty acid attached, but we focused on one here. So we were wondering, well, we have these very small differences in structure. What do these emulsifiers then do on the texture of a food, of our cream? So, and I hope the video works now. Video is always risky. And I'm sorry about the video quality. I'm not very good with making videos, as you will see very soon. But if it works, yes. So it really changes, the emulsifier really changes the emulsion properties. So you see you have in this cup, you have an emulsion, and you can, it's liquid. So you can just take it with a pipette and squeeze it out. The next trial is a bit better on the video. And something very interesting happens when you squeeze it out, is that basically just through squeezing, you whip your emulsion. So you don't need to whip it for some time, but basically through choosing a good combination of emulsifiers, you get a very easily whippable product. If you use other emulsifiers, you can whip a lot and it will not work. You will not get an emulsion. So another aspect that you can change from the emulsifier, and this is again linked to texture, is the temperature stability. So what is considered here an elevated temperature, which is I think more a normal temperature in Indonesia, is that at a certain temperature your materials, your fats start to melt. And depending on the emulsifier that you use, for example, with this stearic acid citram, it basically forms a shell. So it protects the droplet. And we thought initially, well, maybe this shell would be probably quite stable. But we found out that this shell is not completely closed, but it has pores. So it allows for parts of the fat to leak. And this is a problem for the temperature stability of the product. So you could think of reinforcing with other emulsifiers. You could think of reinforcing and improving the stability of the droplet. So this also changes the way the droplets interact. A very nice effect to look at is, I said before, these emulsifiers are mainly on the surface, but they also have an effect on what's inside the droplet. So you see here some microscopic images of fat crystals. And depending on the ratio of the emulsifier that you use, they have an effect on the way that the fat crystallizes. So you can, through your choice of emulsifier, you can control whether you have smaller or larger crystals. And this will have very strong effects on your texture properties. So, and this also links to what we saw before in the video, the shear sensitivity. So basically that if you squeeze them, they flocculate and make this thick emulsion instead of the thin one. So what I wanted to say with a lot of words in one sentence maybe is that with very small differences, so basically mainly one double bond difference in the emulsifier, you can cause really strong effects on your texture. And this is something, if you want to develop a food product, for example, it's good to think about, because if you go to suppliers for emulsifiers, they will give you the list, and then it's like, often it's question marks, what do we do and which one do we choose? And this also links really to the sensory properties. So this is from another group that I can just tell you here, and then you have the source in the presentation below there. The emulsifier not only affects the texture of the product and the flow behavior of the product, but also directly how we perceive it. So if you want to make a product, it's really important that you consider which emulsifier you want to use. So they did a very, very simple but very, I think, elegant experiment. So they made an emulsion, same amount of fat, and they added different amounts of emulsifiers. So on top here they used in both cases whey protein, which is a very good emulsifier, and they used 1%, and for the other emulsion 0.1%. So they used less emulsifier. And just after they made it, they look very similar. The droplets here are a little bit bigger because you have not enough emulsifier to make small emulsions. But then they gave these emulsions to people and said, well, just process it in your mouth like you would, like mouthwash, for example. Just rinse it a bit in your mouth and then spit it out, and we look at it. And what they observed is that for this emulsion with a lot of emulsifier, nothing much happens. But if you use an emulsion with barely enough emulsifier, your emulsion will get unstable. So you will get these very large droplets. So all the droplets basically kind of coalesced. And they also asked people how they perceive the emulsions. And the very interesting part here is that the less stable emulsions, so the ones with less emulsifier, were perceived as more creamy. And creamy, again, is an attribute you want in your food products. And the reason they identified for this behavior is that these large droplets really nicely coat your oral surface, while these very stable emulsions, you just swallow it and there are no residues. Now, this is, of course, a problem because from a technological point of view, you want a very stable emulsion. From a sensory point of view, in this case, you want a bit less emulsifier. So it is a bit of an optimization problem. What you also have is the choice of emulsifier. So you can think of emulsions that are, or emulsifiers that don't change during your consumption, but you can think of emulsifiers that do change. So one also commercially available emulsifier, and I'm not advertising now for this emulsifier, it all has disadvantages, is OSA starch. So this is a starch that has been chemically modified. And what happens while in your mouth, you have amylase, and amylase is an enzyme that degrades starch. So basically it's an emulsifier that is, while you consume it, it falls apart. So the emulsion gets very unstable in your mouth, and it basically forms these patches of oil, which is something you want because the emulsion will be perceived as more creamy, while this whey protein isolate-based emulsion will be more stable. Again, you need to balance here. Do you want stable emulsion? Do you want to be perceived more creamy? So it is not so easy to just say, okay, let's go for this emulsifier. This is really, yeah, just to see, well, to show emulsifiers on such a small length scale also affect the sensory perception. No. Yeah. So yeah, why do we need emulsifiers? We want to stabilize the emulsion in the end from a technological point of view, but we can also use these emulsifiers and their molecular structure to affect, for example, the shear sensitivity. Think of the emulsion that basically got thick while pipetting, or also the sensory perception, so the creaminess. So this time structure on a very small length scale affecting the sensory perception and texture. So now again back to this drawing that I showed you with the food structure on the very left end and the large centimeter scale differences on the right hand. So I also want to give you an example where food structure matters on a much larger length scale. And there it really, and this example really widens a bit the scope from not only sensory perception, but also to other aspects. And I'd like to show you how we can use structure of composite foods on a really millimeter and centimeter scale and the shape of foods, how to steer the perception of people and their preferences. And there's also a very nice way and very subtle way of changing how much people eat. So we can, for example, think of adding particles, changing the properties of these particles. And yeah, food shape, for example. How can we use that? And just as an addition here, food shape in general is a very unexplored research area. So if we talk about that, as mentioned before, we have to widen a bit our scope. So not only talk about structure and texture and sensory perception, but this also links to what people like, what they prefer in terms of consumption and food intake. So that's the very, I think, what I find very nice about food science. It gets very complex very quickly, but very interesting. So imagine you want to make a yogurt, you want to produce a yogurt. You could think of, maybe you want to add fruit particles. So these are some, I have to say artificial, but these are some peach particles. And you could imagine to add small particles, large particles, many particles, small amount of particles, or no particles whatsoever. And the question is a bit, well, what do these particles do? Because they are also a sort of centimeter scale structure. And some people actually tested it. They got some very interesting results, or I think they are very interesting because they sound quite plausible, and they are actually also plausible. But before it hasn't been shown, so like in a systematic way. So basically, if you add particles to a food item, people tend, or specifically with yogurt, people tend to eat slower, and they eat much slower. Probably because they need to be, like, not on purpose, but they want to be sure that it's everything properly chewed. So they take more time. Well, if you have just a plain yogurt without anything, it's much safer to swallow early. It will also change how people and who actually likes the product and where the preference is. So for example, and this has been tested with Dutch consumers, this may differ in other consumer groups a lot. So for example, for these Dutch consumers, young people prefer smaller particles. So for example, if you want to make a yogurt with particles and you want to target specifically younger groups, you may think, well, if they like smaller particles, maybe you should add smaller particles. On the other hand, if you have an elderly population with where you want to market your product more towards elderly people, they really preferred soft particles, which you can imagine, like if they don't chew that well anymore, maybe you add softer particles, which for them also is safer to swallow. So the properties of your particles, of your structure of your structuring that you add here, really on a centimeter scale, really tunes who likes the product, the preference, the liking, and the way we eat it. And one finding that I found quite interesting is that you can use this approach to trick consumers, but trick in a positive way. And they showed this in this study. They showed it with grainy yogurt. So grainy. So yogurt in a sense that people in here it has been shown in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands are used to is not grainy. So they want a smooth, consumers there want a smooth product. So if you have something grainy, like imagine you add sand to your yogurt. This is something people really don't like. And they don't expect that there is something grainy in there, and they really will not buy the product. So, but this could happen, for example, because of the process, something doesn't work, or you add some ingredients like plant proteins that are perceived as grainy. And now you wonder, well, my process or some ingredients that I want in this yogurt, they are perceived as grainy. What can I do? And here we can use again structure to trick consumers trick has such a negative connotation, so we can distract people. I talked before about the pitch particles, and so these researchers tried to use pitch particles to distract consumers from the graininess, but that doesn't work at all. What worked, for example, are or is granola. So basically grains, nuts, these particles. And why does it work and how does it work? Well, what they observed is if they have a yogurt and they add like small cellulose particles that cause a graininess, the liking of the product really goes down. So people don't like this product. But if they also add granola, the liking didn't go down. So people, even though they still perceive the gritty and graininess from the added cellulose particles, they still like the product. So what that means is that the grittiness was not masked. So it's not really masking, because people still were able to say, well, this product is gritty or grainy, but it changed the focus of attention. And this is very much linked to the expectations of consumers. What do your consumers expect? People, at least for this specific group of consumers, Dutch consumers, people don't expect small hard particles in your yogurt. So you don't expect sand particles in your yogurt. And because you don't expect it, people really don't like it. But also, this is the reason why the peach didn't work. So if you add peach particles, well, people perceive the peach and they say, oh, there's peach in there, how nice. But they still don't expect hard particles in a peach yogurt, so they don't like it. But small particles are something that are common for granola, for example. So it matches the expectation of people. So what we see and we can learn from that, even though it sounds pretty simple as an experiment, is that the expectations of people determine the way how they interpret certain sensory stimuli. And the way they interpret these stimuli really affects whether they like the product, whether they don't like the product. So what I want to show here is basically that structure. We cannot only change the texture of a product or the sensory perception of a product, but it has very strong, very powerful tool to change liking and consumer preference. I haven't showed you yet the example for food intake. So as an important message, you should match your consumer expectations, or at least prepare your consumers if there's something unexpected happening that generally is positive with liking. And we can use structure to distract people. Now, the last example I showed you about perception and preference, but we can also use structure to, in a very subtle way, change how much people eat. And the research question in this work was basically, how much do we eat when you combine the foods? Because very often you don't eat the food by yourself. Like, well, you may eat the food by yourself, but you don't eat a single food item, but you use, for example, some dip, like you have some chips with some sauce, for example. And what these researchers were wondering is, if we now have a different shape of these chips. So they used more long ones, more long-shaped chips, and very thin, finger-shaped chips. The same, so crackers, the same product, just baked in different shapes. They gave people a bowl of dip, like a cheese dip, and they gave them these chips, these crackers, and they said, well, you can eat as much as you want, and you have about an hour time. They got a video to watch, and how much would they eat? And the interesting part here is that the amount of crackers or chips that they ate was not influenced by the shape of the crackers, but what changed a lot is the amount of dip. And this is quite plausible, right? If you think about it, the finger shape basically reduced the amount of dip that people ate. So you can imagine if you dip your crisp or your cracker with some dip, you won't manage to get as much as dip on your cracker. But what this means, this finding is quite interesting, because basically it allows us to modify the amount of product that a consumer will eat by changing the shape of for example, the chip that you provide. So if we want to reduce calories, because people eat too much. You could think of reducing, of providing chips of a specific shape. Or if you have people where they don't eat enough, like elderly people, you may want to create a shape that helps them to eat more. And this is a way of changing the amount that people eat. It's a very subtle way, because it doesn't change the convenience of the consumption, and it doesn't cause more effort for people. So what I want to with these examples, what I want to show you is that food structure is actually really an interesting tool that we can understand both from a fundamental point of view, where we try to understand, well, which structures cause which physical properties of a product. So really a material science viewpoint. But it also is, from a more applied viewpoint, it's quite powerful, because we can change the processing behavior, readability. We can change the sensory properties. The product can get more thick, more creamy. And we can also change the consumer appreciation on a very, for example, very large length scale. If you add particles, we can improve liking of product, for example. So yeah, this is something that really I like about food science, that it's a very multidisciplinary field, from where you have expertises and where you need people with expertise in very different areas. Yeah, so just some thoughts basically on food structure, texture, sensory perception. Yeah, if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer. I will try to answer them, and you can send me an email, whichever you prefer. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philip, for the wonderful presentation. But I think before we move on to the discussion session, I would like to invite all of the participants to turn on the camera so we could take some virtual pictures together. Okay, we'll wait for a little bit. I think the operator could turn off the spotlight from Dr. Philip. Okay, Dr. Philip, I'm sorry. I think you can you turn off your share screen?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Yes. I think we have 3 slides of participants. We'll start with the first one. Okay, on my mark, everyone. I'll have to invite once again everyone to turn on your camera, if you please. Okay, on my mark. 1, 2, 3. Okay, moving on to the next slide. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and the last slide. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you, everyone. So now we're moving to the discussion session. I believe there would be a lot of interesting questions from the participants. So if you have any question or anything to discuss, you can raise your hand and then unmute yourself and ask the question yourself to Dr. Philip. Or you could also leave the question in the chat box and I'll read the question.
Hello.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to ask, can we make yogurt, or can we alter the creaminess of the yogurt using emulsifier? If we can, what kind of emulsifier do you suggest in yogurt? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Well, that's actually a challenging question. It depends a bit what market you aim for. Like, for example, like many people like natural foods, where you have very like a clean label products, right? Like where you have as little ingredients, little chemical looking ingredients as possible. So for yogurt, for example, you may consider to avoid emulsifiers. Basically, you typically ferment it and you could, through some processing, for example, you have the difference between like the ones that the yogurt that you produce in big tanks, and then you pump it and it gets more creamy, and you have the one that you have produced in cups. So that I'm not sure. Well, what may work with yogurt is some starches. People may add some starches or some other carbohydrates to change the creaminess. Maybe the emulsifiers could work. I have to say, I don't know. I would my first guess would be rather some hydrocolloids like starches or something in that range.
Okay, sir. I get it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other participants would like to ask some questions? Or maybe Padasa would start some discussion?
Yes, perhaps regarding the emulsifier, for example, here the conditions now, mixologist is on the rise. For example, one of the company prepare the syrups for that mixologist for hotel, restaurants, and cafe. We call it horeca. One of the problem for these syrups is actually some of the syrups may separate because of we add quite many number of flavors in that one. As mentioned, that mixologist is on the rise in Indonesia. There are quite many small medium enterprises problem that these separations sometimes are difficult. That emulsifier, for example, we add some lecithin in that one to help the separations do not occur later because of certain of flavor may separate, not because of the syrup itself. So do you have an idea, because the syrup is high in sugar, that may help these emulsifications better for the syrup?
Well, it's also an interesting question. I think in general, for many products where you have flavor components, it's very complex. Like what I know from FMCGs, so fast moving consumer goods with like room fragrances and these things. It's actually quite complex to stabilize the fragrance or the flavor. More emulsifier. No, more doesn't always help. Different. Well, I think this is very much an effect probably of the. It depends what chemicals you have in the flavors.
In the flavor. Okay.
They may change also the way that the emulsifiers basically where they are, if they have a preference, and yeah, it's a complex one. You could also think of adding weighing agents to your, if it's an oil-based one, to make the droplets. So is the question is a bit the separation you see, is it basically an oil phase separating from an aqueous phase, or is it
oil phase separating from the aqueous phase?
You could try weighing agents. If possible, well, this will not, for example, what will not help is if you afterwards dilute it, you could think of adding some yield stress to the material, if that is possible. So adding some hydrocolloids that keep the droplets trapped, as long as it's in a syrup. If you dilute it, then it gets probably a bit messy again. But if we assume that consumers directly consume it after it got diluted, that may help. Yeah, spontaneously, I wouldn't have a solution, I have to say.
Okay. Thank you. So actually, although the syrup, it seems separate, but when you mix it and pour it into the, because in this, the syrup is the like the solution base, later they will add it into the punch or add it into the drink. There wouldn't be a problem in the drink, but the problem really what we see is directly in the syrup itself before they make it, or they added some water into the drink. The drink wouldn't be problem. But yes, that's true that adding some more emulsifier would not help it. Perhaps would it be work as some stabilizer? What do you think?
I think that's worthwhile a trial, like one thing to try is, for example, if you have all droplets, maybe because of some interaction, your interface is not strong enough. So you could consider through charges. Maybe the charge situation is as such that the droplets don't repel each other enough. So that would be something like some hydrocolloids and other stabilizers. Maybe also depending on the pH, like depending on how acidic the syrup is, that might be a problem, because, for example, some emulsifiers would stop to have a charge on specific pH ranges, and generally charge helps you to stabilize the product or the emulsion. So because the emulsions repel each other better, the droplets. Could be something to try, or you could try like several layers of emulsifiers. So you first add, for example, a negatively charged emulsifier. Now then we have a problem. Then we have a problem with with getting something positively charged in food. That's a bit complicated. Maybe some amidated pectin, for example, that has some positive charges, and you could add as a protective layer around the droplet to help that the droplets don't coalesce. But these are now some very specific ideas. It's difficult to let's say to find a nice spontaneous solution.
Thank you very much for the answer and the idea. Yes, perhaps we will try later for the pectin to add as a positive rate, but with negative first. Yeah, thank you for the information. Yes, it is true that the emulsification is not that easy. Sometimes emulsifier not that help. Yeah, like life itself. To find a partner also is not that easy with finding agent. Yeah, so it's just finding a partner also difficult. See, Mbak Puput, finding a partner is also difficult. So we need a good agent, yeah, to connect, to relate people to people also. So it seems like the food itself, emulsifications also need to reduce the surface tensions, yeah. So it could be clop each other and find the partner. It's not related to food, but with the life itself, since Boku also the University of Life. So I think the time is already up. Any questions?
I think I saw someone raised their hand. Can you raise your hand again? Or maybe the question got canceled. I don't know.
Okay.
We ran out of time also. Okay, so now that we are at the end of our agenda, I would like to deliver our biggest appreciation once again to Dr. Philip Berman for sparing your time today to have this lecture session with us. Thank you very much. We can't wait to see you in person, hopefully soon in Bogor. I also would like to thank all dear participants for joining us today. I hope we all could get beneficial information and knowledge from this session. So once again, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dr. Philip.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It was really nice. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is the students. Mas Henning, Mbak Zulpa,